Well, good evening. We're glad that you were able to make it tonight. Uh, there are many times that we realize that there's a lot going on in our world that we just don't really have any control of, do we? Mount St. Helens is one of those that's just an incredible phenomenon. Psalms 104, verse 32 says, He looketh on the earth, and it trembleth. He toucheth the hills, and they smoke. What's significant about this scripture verse is that it reminds us of two ongoing things that are happening all over the world, hopefully not simultaneously, but sometimes it is. And that's one, and that is earthquakes. And then the other, of course, is volcanoes. With Mount St. Helens, we have both of those happening. At first, in May of 1980, May 18th, that is, in 1980, there were two significant things that happened simultaneously, and that was one, of course, first at 8:32 in the morning of Sunday morning, and that's very significant. I'll get to that in a little bit here. The first thing was an earthquake that happened at 5.1 on the Richter scale. And then what followed, of course, was the 9-hour eruption, which my wife will get into shortly here. And so earthquakes and volcanoes are those devastating items that man can't wrap himself around. It's interesting when you think about earthquakes and volcanoes and tornadoes and hurricanes, and it's interesting when they write these down in insurance, they call it an act of God because it's beyond our human understanding. Now, in terms of what happened in the worldwide flood, that makes it more clear that these would be events that would be reminders, leftovers, if you will, of an earth that's broken up and now trying to put itself back together. Mount St. Helens gives us a glimpse of what occurred during the worldwide flood, not only geological, but also, even more importantly, spiritual. We see God's hand of mercy, really, and also His grace, not only with Mount St. Helens, but with also other events, of course, that have taken place all over the world with other earthquakes. I had mentioned that the volcano erupted first, the earthquake, and then the volcano at 8:32 a.m. Sunday morning. That is so amazing, because if you think about the significance of that. Now, let's back up just a little bit. Mount St. Helens is one they knew was going to explode. It was just a matter of time. Geologists had been studying this area for several months, and they had seen the bulging side, and they realized it was going to be happening any minute. People were warned months ahead of time to evacuate the area. Now, typically we know that volcanoes, they explode vertically, don't they, and not horizontally. But this, of course, would make it even more significant, which we'll go into details here in a little bit. But it's important that it would be on Sunday morning, that in God's mercy and His grace, He would allow it to be where the loggers would not be out there working, and others that would be in church and other places there Sunday morning. And that was an amazing opportunity for people to look at that and realize. Another thing that was interesting about this, and we see God's hand of mercy and grace, is that the nature of this volcano would exploding horizontally and not vertically, as I said a moment ago, and that the area that it would be scattering the 9 hours eruption of the ash, destroying all the trees and all, was an area away from the cities. And so many people were spared. Now, it's interesting, there was a gentleman, those of you who are 50 years of age and maybe 45, perhaps, or older, probably heard of a character by the name of Harry Truman. Not the president, but he was adamant, an 80-year-old man, he was adamant that he was going to stay there in Spirit Lake in front of Mount St. Helens no matter what. Well, he did. And he's buried in several hundred feet now, his body there. But it reminds us also of of another person, and that is Noah back several years before, who would spend 120 years building the ark. And at the same time, as 2 Peter tells us, he was a preacher of righteousness, in that he would spend years preaching to the people to repent, because God's judgment was coming upon the earth. There was a visual reminder there at the Creation Museum. I remember looking at a diorama, and the diorama has that final week before the flood came, that Noah and his family, God told them, it's time for you to get into the ark. And so they did. And that door remained open. And that diorama shows Noah and his family looking down at the people with a look of on their face of sorrow, because these people would not listen. And that the people looking back at them from outside the ark were laughing and jeering and scoffing, something they had been doing for 120 years. And then God himself closed that door, sealed it. So just as those people were warned there at Mt St Helens, and some, of course, heeded that, but then there were quite a few still deaths because of that. But it would have been a whole lot worse, obviously, if not the nature of the blast. So it's a lesson for us today, really, that we continue to share the truth to people, whether they believe it or not. And that hopefully that before they die, that they would repent and come to Christ. And so, but if you think about Noah, tragically, 120 years, not one person changed their mind and joined them other than his family. How tragic that is. Some people did heed the warning there at Mt St Helens, but there were some who didn't. But if you think about the way that God works, that even through disasters, now with Mt St Helens, we're going to turn our attention to the scientific aspect and how that affected in a small microcosm way of what the flood would have been like some 3,500 years ago. And with that, I'm going to have my son come up, and he's going to share a poem with you, and then my wife is going to come up and share a scientific lesson on Mt St Helens.
Many generations have come and gone, but the story of the stones is read all wrong. Evidence of the flood now promotes Satan's lie. Geological features show millions of years. There is no God controlling, or so it appears. So man could see the folly of Satan's fairy tale. God allowed him to witness the flood on a miniature scale. Canyons carved in hours, sediment layered high, uprooted trees replanted on the bottom of the lake. All this did God orchestrate, just for man's sake. In 1980, on the 18th of May, God put his mighty power on permanent display. He shook the mountain, and smoke filled the sky. Then the world watched as Mt St Helens blew. Perhaps man will now listen to the story that is true.
All right, we're going to look now at the events of Mt St Helens. What happened that day 30-something years ago? First, there was an earthquake that morning, as Brian mentioned earlier. And that earthquake was enough to shake the mountain and to make the bulging side that had been growing for months to go sliding off in a landslide. It was the largest landslide that man had ever witnessed. And that landslide was just like taking the lid off of a pressure cooker. All the super hot water inside instantly turned into steam and came blasting out. A blast that would last for 9 entire hours. In that one day, 2/3 of the mountain had been blown away. Now, the remarkable thing about Mt St Helens was when that landslide slid down, it formed like a cup facing towards the north. So then when the blast happened, the blast went directly north. Any other direction, it would have gone into the towns and the cities. But as it was, it just leveled the forest. The man who took this picture was standing 3 mountain ranges away from Mt St Helens. He was where it was supposed to be safe. They weren't expecting that volcano to come out horizontally. However, that blast came directly at him. If it had not been for the mountain right in front of him, if you notice the trees there in the lower part of the screen, that's the mountain in front of him. As the blast came across, it hit that mountain, reflected up over where he was standing and down on the other side. It went all over his head. Here we can see the growing lava dome. Right? After the eruption, the lava started pushing its way back up. It's an interesting thing that ICR did was they took some rock from that brand new lava dome and they sent it off to be tested, not telling where the rock came from. Came back 350,000 years old. That's using radioactive dating. So they were comparing how much potassium and how much So they were comparing how much potassium with how much organ was inside that rock. And it came back with a very old date, even though it's a very young rock. So that shows us that even the radioactive dating methods aren't actually accurate. Now, when the landslide happened at Mt St Helens and the side of that mountain went rushing away, a fourth of it rushed into Spirit Lake, which you can see here as the landslide has slid into Spirit Lake. And as it all slid into Spirit Lake, it caused the water of Spirit Lake to form huge waves, which rushed across the lake and hit the other hillside. And as that huge wave hit the hillside and washed back into Spirit Lake, it carried all the trees that had been growing there around Spirit Lake into the lake. So then there was a huge floating log mat on Spirit Lake. Such a huge mat that they thought the lake had disappeared. It was totally covered with logs. Here you can see part of those logs still there on Spirit Lake. Over time, the logs have become waterlogged and they have sunk. But even 30 years later, we still have a floating log mat on Spirit Lake. Now, Dr. Austin did his dissertation on coal beds, and he had a theory that the coal beds that we see today have actually come from floating logs. And as the floating logs deteriorate and as their bark breaks off and sinks to the bottom, those buried log mats then become the coal that we have today. But he never had a laboratory, so to speak, to test that idea until Mt St Helens went off. And now he's got floating logs to see what is happening underneath. So he and a buddy actually went scuba diving there at Mt St Helens down in Spirit Lake to find out what's happening on the bottom of the lake. And they made 2 discoveries. First, they did a sonar to see what they could see, and then they actually scuba dived down under the lake. And the first discovery they made is that bark has accumulated on the bottom of the lake 3 feet deep. Now, scientists like to say, geologists like to tell us that it takes a long time for peat to slowly accumulate in a swamp. But here at Mt St Helens, we see how quickly it happened. So when you compare that to coal beds that we find all over this world, it's easy to picture in your mind floating logs during the flood and the bark rubbing off and sinking, and then underwater mud flows burying that bark, and then more bark is sinking and becoming buried. And the layers could very easily happen quickly during the flood. Now, the other thing they discovered at the bottom of Spirit Lake is upright trees sitting on the bottom of the lake as if that's where they grew. In fact, if we could drain Spirit Lake today and walk along the bottom, we would say, wow, look at the forest that once grew here. But it's not where the forest grew, it's where the forest sank. Just like places all over the world today, we can find upright, petrified trees, but that's not necessarily where they grew. It could very easily be where they sank during the flood. This is a petrified tree at Yellowstone National Park. And the interesting thing about this tree is there's no roots. It is only a root ball. So it's no way that this is where the tree grew, that this is where it sank. Now, 1/4 of that landslide rushed into Spirit Lake, but 3/4 of the landslide came and filled the valley right next to Mt St Helens. Right, so 3/4 of the Toutle River Valley then, it was buried by 600 feet deep of sediment. It blocked streams and it created lakes, which you can see circled there at the top corner. That's a brand new lake that was created when the stream was blocked by this landslide. Now here's an example of an upright tree that looks like that's where it grew, but this is a tree that actually came from the base of the mountain. That landslide went rushing through this valley, and as it did, it carried rocks and trees with it. And this is one that was rushed through, rode on the landslide until it came to a halt here. And this next picture shows us that it's definitely not where it grew, for this one's upside down. Now that high energy landslide, as it went rushing through the valley, it was just like waves of sediment. And so it left waves of hilly waves all through the valley there. And the interesting thing with the Mt St Helens, it was covered with ice and snow. So as the landslide happened, and it wasn't just mud and dirt and rock, but it was also huge hunks of ice that were carried through this valley and then buried along the top. And when the ice then melted, it formed little ponds. So all throughout the area, you find little ponds surrounded by these hills. It reminded us a whole lot of upper Minnesota, with the steep hills they have with little ponds dotting everywhere. Now during the eruption, the landslide came and filled the valley with 600 feet of sediment, but then 2 years later, there was a mud flow that came out of the mouth of the crater, rushing down through this valley and carved the canyon system in just one day. Right, so there was a small eruption that melted all the snow that had collected in the crater, and that's where the water came from that then went rushing over the crater side, rushing down the mountain, carving this canyon system. Here's a close-up of the canyon wall. And normally you would look at this and you would think, see the little stream, the little river there. I wonder how long it took for that little river to carve that canyon. But this little river didn't carve the canyon. A mud flow carved this canyon in just one day. And now the little river just follows the course of the canyon of the mud flow. Here's right at the base of Mt St Helens. There's an aerial view of part of that canyon. Again, it wasn't carved by the river, but it was carved by the mud flow in just one day. And this whole drainage system was carved out, again, in just one day. Now there's two people there standing on the side of this cliff, talking to one another, and they're asking, I wonder how long it took for the little stream to carve this canyon. But again, and that's the way we typically think. When you think of the Grand Canyon, you think, how long did it take the Colorado River to carve the canyon? But here, the river had nothing at all to do with the carving. A mud flow came rushing through here, carving the canyon. So when we think of that, we need to realize that other canyons that we find in this world weren't necessarily carved over eons of time by the rivers that run through them, but they too have been carved, could have been carved quickly. Now we'll look at the sediment that filled that valley. The top layer that you see, that dark brown layer, that was the mud flow that happened 2 years after the eruption. As the mud flow came rushing through, it not only carved the canyon, but it left a layer across the top. The middle layer that you see, that's from June 12th. That's a month after the eruption. There was a small eruption. It laid that layer. The bottom layer that you see, That was all laid in the one day during the 9-hour eruption. That was the ash that fell from the sky that accumulated very quickly. But if you notice how finely lined those sediments are there in the middle, geologists like to think that you can count the layers and every layer equals a year, but not so at Mt St Helens. At Mt St Helens, all these layers were laid very, very quickly in just one day. If you see here with the hand showing how finely those layers were, fast-moving steam will sort things into layers, or fast-moving water. But that was just the top part. Underneath that was 600 more feet of sediment. The actual landslide of that morning is still beneath there. Beneath there is the buried trees. Beneath there is the part that we haven't even seen yet. So all of that sediment happened very, very quickly. Now, if we know Mt St Helens happened quickly, is there any way for sure we can say the Badlands happened slowly over millions of years? No, there's not. There is no proof that the Badlands happened slowly, or that the Grand Canyon layers happened slowly. And if we don't know how long it took for the layers to be laid, then we don't know how old the fossils are within. Now, while Mt St Helens was erupting, the backside of Mt St Helens, remember, was still covered with glaciers, and those glaciers very quickly melted and started sliding off the backside of the Mt St Helens. They formed a mud flow that very quickly rushed down, rushed through the valley here, uprooted all of the trees. And there you can see again where the mud flow had rushed through. Now this picture was taken 30 years later. The trees are starting to grow back now, as you can see there. In this picture here, it shows where there's a springtime river, and that keeps the trees from growing back in this area. So every spring, as the snow melts and this becomes a rushing river, any little trees that might have begun growing are washed out again. But then the mud flow came through and carved this canyon through solid rock. And again, it's not the little stream that carved the canyon. It's the mud flow that carved the canyon in just one day. Now, another interesting thing that happened at Mt St Helens is called concretions. The concretions were made when ash from the eruption fell in the streams, and they were twirled and twisted in the streams there and collected and then hardened into these very dense balls called concretions. And at Mt St Helens, there were several that were formed, all very small because we're talking about small streams. However, you can find concretions all over the world, some very unusual ones. Here's in a Kentucky road cut where you see a concretion. These in the coal fields are very dangerous because they're very dense, heavy rock. And as the coal miners are digging out the coal, all of a sudden they'll loosen these and they'll come falling. There's a whole row of concretions in Colorado. They're in a road cut, right? So remember we said that these at Mt St Helens, they formed when the ash was collected in the water, and the swirling of the water condensed them into the concretions. So imagine, how did these form here in the layers? There must have been swirling water involved. Here's some concretions up on the hilltop in South Dakota. So they're not just still embedded. These are actually on the hill. Everything else around them has been eroded away. And these are some pretty large concretions. This is a mystery of geology. How in the world did these huge concretions form? Unless you think in terms of the worldwide flood, when the entire surface of the earth was covered with water. And here's some in Kansas City. Out in the middle of nowhere is Rock City. with these huge concretions. The top picture is an aerial view. They look like just huge marbles from long ago. There's a lot of unexplainable things that we see in this earth, but if you think of it in terms of the flood, it makes it much more understandable. Canyons speak of catastrophe, of floodwaters rushing to the sea. Fossils speak of tragic death, the drowning of animals that once held breath. Coal beds speak of floating logs, not millions of years of swamps and bogs. Oh, to those who will listen, the rocks will say, there really is a God, and you need to obey.